Gildan Media presents Your Coach in a Box, affordable, life-changing audio programs.
Mind as Builder. The Positive Mind Metaphysics of Edgar Cayce by Mitch Horowitz. Narrated by Mitch Horowitz. The spiritual is the life. The mental is the builder. The physical is the result. Edgar Cayce reading 254-42, July 15th, 1928. Dedicated to ARE members, past, present, and future. This book is based on a talk delivered at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, ARE, on April 1st, 2016, Mind as Builder, Ancient Wisdom and Modern Insight. When I come to ARE, I always feel that I'm not only among friends, but also collaborators. Being here gives me an opportunity to focus and question some of my own ideas. You'll have to put up with my repeating something that I've said before about ARE. As Ronald Reagan once remarked, if you have something you believe in deeply, it's worth repeating. I take that to heart. As far as I'm concerned, ARE is the greatest growth center our nation has produced. I've spoken and studied at spiritual centers on both coasts, but I find something truly special about ARE, not only because the institution and its staff and members exude the goodwill and neighborliness that was so deep a part of Edgar Cayce's character, but also because ARE is the member-supported non-sectarian growth center that Edgar and his son Hugh Lynn considered vitally necessary for the spiritual culture of this nation. ARE grew out of the most difficult period in Edgar Cayce's adult life. It was in the early 1930s, after his hospital here in Virginia Beach had closed. The hospital, which now stands refurbished as a health spa and school less than 100 yards from where we're gathered, combined allopathic and alternative treatments with many of the ideas from Edgar's channeled medical readings. Its opening in 1929 represented the realization of a lifelong dream for Edgar. But its closure in February 1931, less than 2 years after it began, reflected not only an economic failure brought on by the Great Depression, but also Edgar's personal failure to navigate arguments and frictions among trustees and donors who had abruptly pulled their support. Had Edgar been a better and more engaged manager, he might have fostered a different outcome. He felt this sharply. "I've been tested," he told his wife Gertrude, "and I've failed." With the closing of the hospital, there was no longer any real organization or congregation around Edgar's work beyond the daybed where he reclined for his readings, often given for strangers who lived long distances away, and the kitchen table where his transcriber Gladys Davis would sit with him and respond to correspondence. In early 1931, with the Great Depression grinding on and Virginia Beach emptied out for the winter, Edgar felt profoundly isolated. Edgar had not only seen the dream of his hospital fail, but with it he came to feel that he had wasted several earlier years of his life unsuccessfully wildcatting for oil in Texas in hopes of self-financing the shuttered facility. With broken relations and spent years behind him, he withdrew into reading scripture, fishing, and chopping wood. In June, Edgar's eldest son, Hugh Lynn Cayce, approached his father with an extraordinary idea. And I ask you to note this very carefully because there was genius and power in what Hugh Lynn brought to his father. He said, "Maybe there's something wrong with us. Suppose we stop expecting people to do things for us and start doing them for ourselves. The world doesn't owe us a living because we have a psychic medium in the family. We ought to work for what we get just as everyone else does. I think it would be wise if we stopped looking for large donations, stopped dreaming of another hospital, and concentrated on developing a little stock in trade. Then, when the next change comes, we'll be better prepared and we won't muff it. I'll take over the job of manager of ARE. We'll keep it small. We'll have a modest budget and a modest program. We'll work quietly by ourselves with the help of the local people who are interested. We'll start study groups. We'll take series of readings on various subjects. We'll build up a library on psychic phenomena. Later on, we'll more fully examine the content and principles of Hugh Lin's statement. But for the moment, consider the main thrust of what he's saying, which is, we created a situation in which we grew dependent on one or two wealthy donors, and when those relationships frayed, when we were left to our own devices, we could no longer function. We need a radically different approach. We must do things ourselves as best we're able. We need our own vehicle, our own newsletters, magazines, and research projects, and most of all, our own network of members who don't just show up at the front door when they want a reading for one particular problem or want to contact Aunt Bessie from beyond and then vanish, but rather we need a membership base that takes a steady, concerted interest in metaphysical questions, in spiritual self-development, and in the teachings that come through the readings, including medical, past life, and spiritual. This membership should be counted on to maintain a lifelong commitment to these interests and to the organization. When I visit ARE today, and I'm certain many of you feel this too, I walk these campus grounds, go through the buildings and library, as well as the new structures that have been added, and within the physicality of the place, I feel the sense that all of these things are an expression of that one idea that Hugh Lin brought to his father, which is that the work must be sustained by the love and dedication of its students. There are many great spiritual centers in America. That's one way in which we're very fortunate. But I really don't think that any spiritual center has that kind of backstory. This place was born on the basis of an idea. An idea is an extraordinary thing, but I must also add this. For an idea to work, it must be executed with assiduousness and dedication. Great ideas are great only in potential. They rely on great execution. Our topic, of course, is the principle of mind as builder. This is a foundational aspect of the Edgar Cayce teachings. In more than 600 of his channeled readings, Edgar used the phrase, the mind is the builder, or sometimes the mental is the builder. In a reading he gave on July 15, 1928, probably one of the great days in this spiritual work, Edgar said from a trance state, the spiritual is the life, the mental is the builder, the physical is the result. Now, isn't that what transpired in connection with Hugh Lin's idea? Let's take apart Edgar's statement using Hugh Lin as an example. Hugh Lin understood that his father's work was good work because it provided a window, a channel of sacred influence into the world and opened up possibilities in the life of the individual. So first of all, when dealing with the principle of mind as builder, one must demonstrate a special kind of persistence and confidence, knowing that the object of one's desires is demonstrably sound. Where does that confidence come from? A lot of people walk around acknowledging, I'm insecure, I'm not confident. That outlook is so common that we see comedians and entertainers crafting a whole character or persona around the notion of being insecure. I'm thinking of Woody Allen, who is actually not insecure at all. He is an extraordinary artist and a powerful person, but he built his screen persona around the idea of being neurotic and second-guessing. We all recognize and laugh at some aspect of ourselves in that. Generally speaking, people do have problems with confidence. But consider, if the spiritual is the life, then that principle contains the solution to a lack of confidence. Is the work that you want to bring into the world, whatever it may be, spiritually sound? Is it something that is going to create a circuit of generativity and productivity among other people? Will it make other people better? Confidence comes from the willingness to be a vessel for something higher. That's why Hugh Lin was authentically confident. Edgar, too, was confident about the nature of his work. Historically, Edgar has a reputation of being a humble, even retiring man. But as the scholar of religion and one of my intellectual heroes, Harmon Brough, has noted, Edgar had a very decisive streak. Harmon spent time with Edgar toward the end of the seer's life and wrote that Edgar stood 10 feet tall and was as strong-willed and capable of risks as Captain Ahab. When Edgar said no, he meant it. He didn't put on airs or behave obsequiously around the celebrities who occasionally approached him for readings. He added their names to the bottom of the wait list like everyone else. Vice President Henry Wallace, one of the most popular figures of the New Deal, was on that wait list when Edgar died in early 1945. Edgar didn't play favorites. But let's not get hung up on details. Being a vessel for something higher can mean all kinds of things. Every time I do an interview, whether it's on NPR or a New Age radio show, the host almost always harbors the assumption that somewhere in our discussion we're going to disparage The Secret. It sometimes seems like everybody hates The Secret, that no one ever liked it. I often encounter New Agers who engage in this game of punch the secret. Now, mind you, I call myself a New Ager, so I use that term in a positive way. To me, New Age refers simply to therapeutic spirituality. I use the term with pride. But I do encounter New Age people who rush to disavow The Secret as though doing so is a mark of seriousness. About 20 million people bought The Secret, yet I rarely find anyone who acknowledges it. Everyone feels compelled to participate in the backlash against it. People typically say things like, the end of all spiritual work shouldn't be the manifestation of a Mercedes-Benz. I can only smile when I hear that. I've been in this work for a long time, writing and publishing books that analyze or express ideas from within the alternative spiritual culture. I have never once encountered anybody trying to manifest a Mercedes-Benz. Rather, I encounter people dealing with addictions, marital problems, career issues, illness, trouble paying the rent, things that are as real as life gets. But never once have I met someone trying to manifest a shiny new car or some such. But if it did happen, I would defend that person. Who am I to judge what creates value, productivity, and goodness in another person's life? I can easily imagine a situation where someone may have grown up in circumstances in which his surroundings were ugly and depressing, and he simply wants the experience of being in touch with or getting around in what is just simply a well-made car. That may not be all he wants, but it may represent something meaningful. I will never condemn that. Don't be too spiritually certain that the only things that matter are those we can't see. Test that. Verify that. So, I don't want you to feel that when I'm talking about a sound influence, I'm restricting you to certain parameters. But I do ask, above all, that you grapple with the question of whether this thing that you want to bring into the world is really going to do good. That is, can it become part of the circuitry or root system of good for another individual? Again, you don't have to let anybody dictate what that thing might be. No one should be made to feel that he is shallow or somehow not spiritual if the thing he wants might be some kind of material gain or personal achievement. Money and resources do a lot of good. Money built this conference center we're gathered in. For those watching this talk online or reading it, money facilitated the devices and books that you use. Money sends kids to school and helps bring beauty into the world. The Bible I read was financed by someone's contributions. So please, let's not have restrictive attitudes toward money. I'm touched by the movie Birdman starring Michael Keaton. Seen from a certain perspective, the hero, played by Keaton, is a slightly over-the-hill movie star who is struggling to retain past glory. But by the end, the film turns that conventional premise on its head. In fact, the protagonist seems like a fairly decent, sincere man who is in his natural element in the spotlight. It is right and worthy for him to be on stage, whereas those who criticize him seem less and less compelling. The movie asks you to take a second look at your values and to be certain that your ideas of right and wrong are authentic and not just memorized truths. Let's return to Hugh Lynn and what he told his father that day. He was filled with confidence because he knew that his father was doing good work, and that, in a sense, is a widely held view today. Some evangelical Christians feel strongly that Cayce was misled. I personally dispute that and believe we have a lot to talk over with our friends in the evangelical world. But suffice to say, those who come near the Cayce work often agree that it gives people a broader sense of possibilities in healing, opens a new window on Scripture and other wisdom teachings, and facilitates forgiveness and reconciliation. ARE and the Cayce centers and camps provide opportunities for kids, seniors, veterans, teachers, and all kinds of different people. Edgar lived by the Gospels, and his work squares with gospel ethics. Hugh Lynn knew that. His dependency was not on himself or on his father, but on the fact that their work was in sync with a higher principle. Hugh Lynn understood his father's words, "The spiritual is the life." Everything emanates from the higher, Hugh Lynn believed, and if you feel that you have placed yourself into the flow or channel of that emanation, you have good cause to feel confident. The core phrase of Edgar's July 1928 reading is, "The mental is the builder." He later used the term, "mind is the builder" or "mind as the builder." Again, this principle appeared in more than 600 readings, so the wording would differ here and there. But at this inceptive reading, he used the phrase, "The mental is the builder." What does it mean? It's a magnificent expression, and it was very suited to the times Edgar lived in. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of remarkable growth and influence for a distinctive American metaphysical culture, often known as New Thought. The American metaphysics of that era, which in a sense have become the American spirituality, rest on the principle that thoughts are causative. Now, in terms of Edgar's language, I feel strongly that no one is just a passive or inert vessel for a certain message. The message that comes through you, or the thing that you live out, is marked by the times in which you live, the values you hold, and your background. So when Edgar was in a trance state, he would speak in tones and vocabulary that sounded a lot like the King James Bible. That was understandable and even necessary given who he was. Edgar was a Disciples of Christ Sunday school teacher. He read Scripture cover to cover for each year of his adult life. He regarded himself first and foremost as a Christian, and at times he struggled to understand some of the teachings that were coming through him, such as reincarnation, astrology, and numerology. These things are not commonly regarded as part of Christianity. I say not commonly regarded because one aspect of Edgar's brilliance was that he could, with great personal integrity, interpret parts of the Gospels to accommodate reincarnation and karma, for example. Edgar studied Scripture and asked himself, in effect, can I understand, without playing games, whether these concepts fit into a Christian framework? His answer was yes. This is why I believe the individual channeler is more than just a loudspeaker transmitting a message. Rather, a gifted channeler might be seen as a fine instrument, and a Stradivarius cello produces a different sound than a violin or a harmonica for that matter. Most of the well-known channelers who have come up since Edgar first used and popularized the term channel sound very differently from him. Helen Schucman, the Columbia University research psychologist and channeler who brought us A Course in Miracles in the 1960s and 70s, did not sound like Edgar at all. Schucman's contemporary, the poet Jane Roberts, who channeled the Seth material, sounded nothing like Helen Schucman. My friend Paul Selig, one of today's most significant channelers, doesn't sound like any of them. Each channeler, like each individual, has outlooks and reference points that stem from different times and situations, and that's going to affect how he sounds. I would hope that if what's being spoken is true, that there's a certain convergence in every channeler's work, a fundamental respect for the human search, a belief that each individual is sacred, and that doing violence to another individual, I'm not talking about defensive action, but something that unjustly violates the sanctity of another, runs counter to the inner search. I think we see that convergence, but still, every channeler must function as part of his or her times. For that reason, I find it significant that in 1928, Edgar used the term, "the mental is the builder." As I mentioned, America's spiritual culture at that time was ignited with the idea that thoughts are causative. That was a very American principle, and it remains at the heart of our culture today. That idea is the central tenet of the positive thinking movement, and it undergirds our national life in ways that people don't always realize. Ronald Reagan was echoing this principle when he said, "Nothing is impossible." Likewise, Barack Obama when he said, "Yes, we can." Some people in journalism and academia today say, "I can't stand positive thinking. Get away from me with your refrigerator magnets and page-a-day calendars. That is for dupes." Yet even those who take that position innately echo the tenet that thoughts are causative. We all understand that self-disparaging attitudes are crippling, at least as much as foolish overconfidence, which is also crippling, as critics will point out. Both, of course, are attitudes of thought, self-conceptions, and both are impactful. This is just another way of affirming Edgar's statement. Decades before Edgar's birth, beginning roughly in the 1830s, America began developing an affinity for the idea of mental causation. The nation eventually became a springboard that projected the ideal of mental causation around the world. Various factors gave rise to this idea in American life. It was not conceived of in isolation, which nothing is. To cover all the historical bases, I would have to draw an arc from Hermetic Egypt to the court of Louis XVI to Phil Donahue, which I do in my book One Simple Idea. And while I love tracing arcs on the family tree of ideas, we have limited time and I don't want to make rushed connections. So let me restrict myself to modern events. In Paris, shortly before the time of the French Revolution, there appeared a figure named Franz Anton Mesmer. He came from the German-speaking part of Switzerland. Mesmer was a physician of a sort. He taught that an invisible etheric fluid animates all of life. He called this fluid animal magnetism. Mesmer believed that if someone was suffering from some kind of physical or mental disorder, this animal magnetism was out of balance. Mesmer said that he could place people in trance states and from these trance states manipulate their animal magnetism through various methods. He called these healing sessions seances, which is how that French term, loosely meaning sittings, came into general use. Mesmer didn't see himself as an occult figure. He saw himself as a rational figure, very much in line with the march of scientific progress. And in a sense, he was, because his brightest students later came to feel that Mesmer was not manipulating any kind of etheric fluid, but rather, when he placed patients into a trance state, he was influencing them by powers of suggestion. Mesmer and his students, in an era before psychological language, happened upon the first Western conception of what was later termed the subconscious mind. Mesmer's method came to be called hypnotism. We routinely use terms such as seance, channeling, positive thinking, mesmerize, hypnotize, as if these things have always been with us, but they haven't. They are related to specific ideas and people. Mesmer was a catalyst for some of these ideas, and he was, not surprisingly, very controversial in his day. He had both powerful friends and enemies. People who were committed to democratic revolution in France tended to like Mesmer because they felt that if all of humanity was animated by this invisible etheric fluid, then we are all just branches of the same tree, and there are no upper or lower classes. There's no aristocracy. In that same vein, some of Mesmer's students were early opponents of slavery. They argued that since Mesmer had proven that there is no essential difference among human beings, and that we're all shot through with this vitalizing invisible fluid or animal magnetism, what possible right does one person have to enslave another, to deprive that person of his physical freedom and human potential? If this invisible etheric fluid animates us all, civic equality must follow from that. In France of the late 18th century, nearly every advance in science and industry took on political overtones. The social and scientific ramifications of Mesmer's experiments were deadly serious. King Louis XVI was hostile to Mesmer because the king's position depended upon the divine right of rule. Louis's divine rule did not comport with the notion that all of us are united by some kind of energy field. So Louis XVI assembled a commission of experts to critically study Mesmer. This was rather like the doctors who at one time stuck needles in Edgar Cayce's feet to test whether he was really in a trance state. The chair of Louis's Royal Commission was America's ambassador to France, Benjamin Franklin. The Founding Fathers had deep divisions of their own about Mesmer. Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were suspicious of him. Both men, Jefferson in particular, were leery of Orthodox religion, and to them Mesmer smacked of a throwback to the days of soothsaying. Others viewed it differently. One of Mesmer's most dedicated students was the Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the American Revolutionary War and a close friend of George Washington's. He even induced Mesmer and Washington to exchange letters. Writing from France, Lafayette praised Mesmer in letters to Washington in 1784. "I know as much as any conjurer ever did," he told Washington. "I will get leave to let you into the secret of Mesmer, which you may depend upon is a grand philosophical discovery." Lafayette was preparing to visit the new United States in fall of that year, not only to see Washington, but also to make a pilgrimage to the nation's first Shaker village outside of Albany, New York. Lafayette had heard about the Shakers going into trance states, holding seances, receiving communications from beyond, and he believed that these activities might correspond with Mesmer's theories. He wanted to investigate matters for himself. A story began circulating in American historical literature in the early 1940s that shortly before Lafayette set sail for the U.S., he had an audience with King Louis XVI, and the king teased him for being friends with Mesmer and wondered what Lafayette's friend General Washington would think of all this mumbo-jumbo. I got a kick out of this story, but I could not find the source, and I wondered whether it was really true. A historian always has to ask that question. People are constantly attributing things to Gandhi or Napoleon or William James that they never said. Was somebody walking behind Napoleon on the battlefield with a quill and leaf of paper, writing things down while dodging cannon fire? And if Louis XVI really said this, who overheard it? I searched and searched for the original quote and came up cold, but eventually I confirmed it. It turns out that following the French Revolution and Reign of Terror, a surviving French military officer who had spent years hanging around Louis XVI's court wrote a 10-volume series on court intrigues. Only the French would do this. I don't speak French, but I have a friend who is a professor of French history who helped me translate the pertinent passage. Sure enough, there was Louis teasing La
Sample complete. Ready to continue?